You're watching Live Now. I'm Austin Westfall. My thanks to Christy Matino. She's had you covered for the past few hours. I've got you covered for the next few hours as we tackle this historic day in the Middle East. A live look at Gaza on this, what is now a day of peace, a day of seeing the remaining 20 living hostages released from the enclave. The time, Israel Standard Time, approaching 11 p.m. at night. President Trump signing a peace deal with other world leaders. Also, as I said, seeing the remaining 20 living hostages released to Israel. We saw Red Cross vehicles transporting those hostages to safety earlier today. In fact, cameras captured most of the operation. And then we've, of course, seen emotional scenes of hostages returning to their homeland. In many cases, seeing those somber moments of families reuniting with their loved ones, seeing them after 2 traumatic years. You see the emotion and unimaginable feeling they must be feeling in these rooms. I'm going to throw things to Fox's Rebecca Castor. This is what we're going to be tackling for the next few hours here. Rebecca with a wrap-up of what's happened in the past 24 hours.
Home at last. One by one, the remaining living hostages reunited with their families in Israel just hours after their release from Hamas captivity. Hearts were placed on their pictures in Hostages Square, marking their return.
When we suffer together. And when we are happy, we're happy together.
President Trump, addressing the Israeli Knesset in Jerusalem, declared this a golden age for Israel and urged the country to work towards lasting peace.
After so many years of unceasing war and endless danger, today the skies are calm, the guns are silent, the sirens are still, and the sun rises on a holy land that is finally at peace.
Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu called the president the greatest friend Israel has ever had in the White House.
Under your leadership, we can forge new peace treaties with Arab countries in the region and Muslim countries beyond the region.
President Trump then traveled to Egypt to finalize his peace plan alongside leaders from more than 20 countries. But the next phase of this deal will likely prove more difficult to implement. That's the disarming of Hamas and the creation of a new governing authority in the Gaza Strip.
I'm hoping that we can finally live in peace. No more missiles, no more anything.
Fox's Rebecca Castor reporting for us. By the way, within the last couple hours, we did see President Trump boarding Air Force One. He made a swing through Israel for a few hours and then to Egypt. He addressed the Knesset in Israel, then addressed world leaders, met with world leaders. That's where the peace deal was signed. It was in Egypt, and President Trump now bound for Edwards Air Force Base in Washington, D.C. We're going to be having a lot of analysts and experts joining us today to break down everything that's happened. A lot has happened. Our first guest of the hour is Natalie Ecanow. She is a senior research analyst at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. Speaking of Air Force One, Natalie, you might have seen this. President Trump was taking questions on Air Force One some hours ago. He said that, quote, the war is over. You understand that. Is it that simple, Natalie? Is the war over?
So I don't think it's as simple as the war being over. Of course, getting the hostages home was always one of Israel's main war aims. Seeing those 20 living hostages return home to Israel today was quite a joyous and momentous occasion. Hamas has also released the bodies of 4 dead hostages. That said, there are still hostages left in Gaza. Hamas has said it's unable to locate some of those bodies. And then we have the tough task, or Israel rather has the tough task ahead of, figuring out with partners and allies how to get Hamas to disarm and relinquish control of Gaza.
So that's going to be a major piece of this. So correct me if I'm wrong. Does today's events conclude phase 1 of the deal?
So from what I can tell, today's events more or less conclude phase 1 of the deal. But let's not forget, this deal was a 20-point plan. So there are many, many phases ahead, lots of roadblocks ahead. Again, Hamas is likely to place stumbling blocks along that road. And then we have, question marks from other countries that are stakeholders in this process, including Qatar and Turkey, both longtime sponsors of Hamas. Both did a great job pressuring Hamas to get this deal across the finish line in the first place, but it remains to be seen whether or not they continue to sustain pressure on their longtime clients.
So you and I have been covering this war so closely on the daily. I need to ask you, just from a researcher's perspective, what we've been talking about for the past 2 years, day after day. There still is living hostages. It's a constant, huge facet of our coverage day in and day out for 2 years straight. How do you feel, and how did you feel, and what was your reaction when you see the images like what you're seeing on your screen? When you saw these earlier today, what was your reaction?
I mean, seeing the hostages come home and embrace their loved ones, it's hard to feel anything but joy. This has been a 2-year struggle, 2 years of living in Hamas hell. This is exactly what the Israelis and the Americans and all of our partners have been working for 2 years, is to see these hostages reunited with their loved ones. So it's genuinely a momentous and historic day.
What's our understanding of what comes next? 20 living hostages returned from Gazan captivity and now back home. My understanding was that they were going to be checked medically. What's next for the hostages?
I'm thankfully not a hostage, so I'm not sure how these men are faring mentally, but I would have to imagine that, after living in captivity for 2 years, obviously some mental and physical health checks are due, and then hopefully rebuilding their lives and getting back to a sense of normalcy after 2 years of being held hostage by terrorists.
I saw a question online earlier today. Somebody asked why there were no women hostages released today. I think you and I know that there's certain levels of how Hamas at least evaluates hostages. Can you give us some of the calculus that's involved and why we're seeing 20 men being released last?
Sure. So if we go back to October 7th, Hamas took, about 250 hostages, and that included men, women, children, the elderly. Thankfully, the women and children were released. Most of the women and children were released during that first ceasefire. It was about a week long in November of 2023. There have been others who were rescued during IDF operations, and also others released earlier this year. Hamas considers most men between, early teens to like mid 50s, 60s even, to be military men, regardless of whether or not they are in IDF uniform. So that's why Hamas was holding these men until the very end, and why we only saw mostly young men released today.
Can you expand on something that you said earlier in the conversation? Jennifer Griffin has this. She says, Hamas has handed over 4 deceased hostages. And by the way, we had video of the transfer. We saw these vehicles earlier on in the day transporting the bodies. These are the videos that we got from some of our partners here. It looks like we're actually having some difficulty with the playback, so we can't play it back. But I want to get to Jennifer's point, which is that 24 remain in Gaza. You said earlier today that there may be some questions over whether or not Hamas actually knows where those bodies are. What do we know about the remaining missing dead hostages?
So right now, we don't know much. Hamas, as I said, and as you pointed out, has said that they're not sure they can locate those bodies. That could be because Israel has done an amazing job battering Hamas's ranks, and there are very few terrorists left with knowledge of the whereabouts of the hostages. It could also, be as simple as Hamas playing games as it's done before and attempting to stall the implementation of this plan and potentially even, thwart its final implementation.
So where do we go from here? I saw President Trump meeting with Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas earlier today in Egypt. What sort of agencies are you looking at within the Palestinian enclave as far as the future governing role goes in the enclave?
So obviously the Palestinian Authority, which is led by Mahmoud Abbas, is, a huge factor in this discussion. I have concerns about the Palestinian Authority taking control of Gaza as it stands. The PA is rife with corruption. It's led by Mahmoud Abbas, who is, in his late 80s. The PA has a long history of paying welfare to Palestinians who carry terrorist attacks out against Israelis and against Jews. So there's definite need for genuine reform here. If the PA is able to undertake serious reform and meet benchmarks set by the United States or other partners and countries, that would be best case scenario. But as far as I see it, finding someone or some agency to take over Gaza is one of the main challenges ahead.
And that's a complete unknown for now. There's no even hints as to any other agency that might be able to take over that role.
I mean, we're also seeing, part of the implementation of this plan is the idea that there'll be some sort of multinational peacekeeping force, if you will, monitoring or taking care of Gaza for a certain period of time. That force is going to include Americans, Qataris, Turks, Emiratis. The concern there is the inclusion of countries like Qatar and Turkey. As I mentioned earlier, both countries are longtime supporters of Hamas. If they've turned a new leaf, great. I haven't seen enough evidence to indicate that that can be, completely verified and a done deal. So there is some role for international players to play here, but remains to be seen how effective that will be.
So we know who the 20 living Israeli hostages are, and they came home in return for over 1,900 Palestinian prisoners. Can you give us some context as to who they are?
Yeah, so the Palestinian prisoners released are a combination of terrorists serving life sentences in Israeli jails, as well as people who've been detained since October 7th. I think the concern there is, there are names on that list of Palestinians to be released who are responsible for very bloody terrorist attacks. And so sending them back out onto the streets raises the concern that, there will be more attacks in the future. And just because they've spent time in jail does not mean they've reformed. And so that's definitely something to be watching for as we move forward.
Gaza's internal Hamas leader, Yahya Sinwar, was once returned as part of one of these exchanges. He himself was a Palestinian prisoner who was swapped with the Israeli government. And then he, of course, became the internal leader within Gaza of Hamas. You mentioned some of these guys were put in prison for some serious crimes. Is it clear to us how many or roughly how many? And by the way, we're looking at video of these prisoners returning to the West Bank hours ago. They were transported on these buses. We're seeing some of the scenes, jubilant Palestinians welcoming some of these people home. Is there any reliable data out there to suggest how many of these prisoners were put in prison for severe crimes versus, if you might say, less severe crimes?
So I'm not privy to any, hard statistics in terms of, how many exactly were put in jail for what crime specifically. What I've seen is that about 200 or 250 of them were serving life sentences. So I imagine if you're serving a life sentence or multiple life sentences, you've carried out a seriously grave crime. About 1,500 to 1,700 have been detained since October 7th. I don't know exactly what for. I imagine some of them were responsible for more violent crime than others. But Israel doesn't usually go around rounding up people for no apparent reason. So it's definitely a concern.
Did anything from Trump's Knesset speech today or anything that we heard from any of the world leaders in Egypt today, did anything that they said stick out to you?
I think Trump's assertion that, we're entering this new era of peace really stuck out to me. I certainly think Trump deserves incredible credit for what he's been able to accomplish over the last couple of weeks. And it does certainly seem like, peace is closer than it ever has been before. That said, there is still a long road ahead, and I'm not sure we can say for certain that we're entering a new era and that the region, is turning a new leaf. There are still several phases to go with this deal, several stumbling blocks along the road ahead, and there's still work to be done. But I do think that, peace is likely more possible than it has been before.
We know that there were some high-stakes talks in Egypt leading into the completion and the agreement to phase one. Is there anything that you're hearing of to indicate when negotiations begun on phase two? Has it already begun?
So there have been talks over the last couple of days about implementing phase two. I'm not sure, as far as the Israelis are concerned or other stakeholders are concerned, whether or not the fact that Hamas has yet to release the remains of those 24 hostages will have any impact on how negotiations proceed. But, I think everyone wants to move as quickly as possible to see this war come to a close.
And what should we be tracking the rest of the week here? Tonight, earlier today, it was perhaps one of the biggest days, if not the biggest day, in the past 2 years of this horrible war that we've covered. What are you looking for in the coming hours? It's the overnight hours, Israel Standard Time. I don't know how much movement we'll see in the coming hours, but what are you watching for the rest of the week?
So I think I'm watching a couple of things. One being, of course, the negotiations for the next phases of the deal. That's, certainly important. But more importantly, I'm really watching how other players in the region react and how they act in the coming days. So again, Qatar and Turkey are key players. So is Egypt. I'm also going to be watching how the media in the region portrays what's going on. The media, of course, has a huge impact on how both Israelis and Palestinians view the conflict or how the conflict is coming to a close. Al Jazeera is a huge piece of the puzzle. There have been reports in recent days that Al Jazeera is starting to shift its tone as part of some sort of understanding between Washington and Doha. As far as I've seen, that shift has not actually materialized, but I'm going to be watching that moving forward.
All right. Natalie Ecanow is with the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. Thanks.